Tamu Morning Show.
Oh! Young, no more!
The fort is breached and the wagons are burning.
Why doesn't the Prime Minister just say the truth and tell the Indigenous peoples that he doesn't give a about their rights?
Free Leonard Peltier. We want to free Palestine.
It's a good day to be Indigenous.
KREZ 1680 AM.
Sangitamu Turtle Island, welcome to the TRN-KREZ Morning Show. Today we have an exciting lineup of the best of the Red Nation podcast from our first year of the show in 2019. It was hard to choose which episodes were clipped in, but we hope you enjoyed the lineup. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in whole, each track is listed as the title of the episode, and we'll have them linked on therednation.org. Join us in celebrating 5 years of the Red Nation podcast. We also want to take the time to thank all of our listeners for supporting the show through the years. Thank you to our patrons on Patreon who support the show year-round. And thank you to all who contributed to the Red Media's GoFundMe. To those who still want to empower Red Media and the Red Nation podcast, this is your last chance to contribute to the GoFundMe. You can find the link in any of our bios. And if you'd like to empower the work year-round, you can also sign up for our Patreon. Thank you for your contributions and for keeping the show going. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did curating these clips. I hope it also leads you to listen to the episodes in whole. It was quite the experience to recall the times we were in 5 years ago, and it was a joy to re-listen to these absolute gems that we had in the beginning. Enjoy, comrades.
While Indigenous peoples are told to quit living in the past, settlers are urged to make America great again by invoking this country's mythic halcyon days. That's the story America likes to tell itself. The story of winning the future of this land by winning its past. The truth is quite the opposite. America fears the past. Reduced to its basic components, the history of colonization boils down to three things: gold, God, and glory. Natives had all the gold, settlers brought God. Now the natives have God and the settlers have all the gold, the story goes. But glory is the most precarious element of this formula. Is there honor in invasion, slavery, genocide, and theft? The answer to that question changes throughout time. But we don't have to journey too far into history to see that the response by Indigenous standards is clearly no. If anything, paradoxically, glory belongs to us, history's losers. In 1971, Richard Nixon ordered the police to evict Indians of all tribes from Alcatraz Island after 19 months of steady Indigenous encampment in the formal federal prison. The protest, however, is not remembered for its failure to achieve its stated goals of reclaiming the Ohlone land for all Indigenous peoples and creating an all-Indian university. And by the way, this coming November will be the 50th anniversary of the Alcatraz protests, or the Alcatraz occupation. Instead, it is remembered for the movement that sparked an era of red power militancy. And Alcatraz resonated beyond the confines of just the Indigenous movement. In 1969, a young Black revolutionary who later took the name Assata Shakur visited the island offering her services as a medic. She marveled at the quiet confidence of the Indigenous activist who had founded a new community, one based on their cultural and spiritual traditions, in and around what was once a notorious penitentiary. Shakur had discovered some of the current native occupiers were once former Alcatraz prisoners. The prison island was also the site where 4 Modoc were hanged, and where Paiute and Apache prisoners of war in Western Indigenous nations were imprisoned in the late 19th century for resisting invasion by the United States. In 1894, the military imprisoned 19 Hopi men at Alcatraz as punishment for refusing to send their children to government-run and church-run boarding schools. The Indigenous prisoners of Alcatraz had faced similar conditions that Red Power activists had faced: a harsh landscape, purposefully isolated from the rest of the world, uninhabitable, abandoned, and in disrepair, much like the Indian reservations from which they had come. They, Indians, damn sure had the same enemy, Shakur recalled, seeing some similarities in Black and Indigenous experiences. She told her new comrades that if they ever visited New York, to look her up in Harlem. Sure, when are you going to liberate it? They asked her. Alcatraz catalyzed an indigenous movement that kicked off occupations of federal lands and buildings across the continent, the height of which occurred during the 71 siege at Wounded Knee, where indigenous activists took over the small town of Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, demanded the ouster of a corrupt tribal administration, and declared independence from the United States. And while a captivated public only saw the spectacle of militant Native men in braids and shades brandishing firearms, James Baldwin saw something else. What Americans mean by history is something they can forget, he said, reflecting on this period of indigenous uprisings. They don't know they have to pay for their history because the Indians had paid for it every inch and every hour. That's why they're at Wounded Knee. That's why they took Alcatraz, he said. And perhaps because they have paid such a heavy price for history, natives have capacious notions of freedom and belonging. At Alcatraz and at Standing Rock, indigenous peoples turned those seen as different into familiars, into allies. They made relations. This is the quiet strength, the victory of indigenous movements over time, the power of love and humanity that doesn't make headlines. At the LAX airport protest in 2017, the Tongva drummers surrounded a Muslim family, singing them in an honor song. The singers welcomed them to their homelands. Tears streamed down a young girl's face. She wore hijab, and moments earlier she appeared frightened, now at peace. This is what it means to go back to where you came from. Nothing about the complex human condition of shared grief, love, and solidarity is alien to that place of freedom. Call it home. So since the era of militant red power protests in the 1960s and 1970s, American Indian scholars have resolved a number of issues confronting what was at the time an emerging field of indigenous studies. First, indigenous perspectives on history, culture, and society are valid fields of inquiry. Second, they have emphasized the need to counter the racist, colonial orientation of previously written history and scholarship. Third, they have emphasized the temporal and spatial aspects of indigenous nationhood, that indigenous nations have existed with relationships to place and territory prior to the creation of settler states like Canada, the US, New Zealand, and Israel, and will continue to exist as nations in spite of such colonizing states. Fourth, they have given priority to interpretations by indigenous peoples themselves. A more radical version of this has been the concerted effort to entirely overturn European settler interpretations of hemispheric and continental histories that justify and legitimate the conquest of the Americas and its peoples to create a new world for European-derived nation-states at the expense of indigenous peoples, their lands, water, and air, and their rightful relations to this world. This work is the foundation of the proliferation of indigenous studies programs globally and is responsible for the assertion that, as far as indigenous peoples are concerned, colonizers and European settlers are historically disqualified. Colonizers and European settlers are historically disqualified from interpreting indigenous peoples to indigenous peoples. And consequently, the phrase indigenous perspective has emerged as an anti-colonial theory and method. And here I'm thinking of the Mara educator Linda Smith's decolonizing methodologies. But an indigenous perspective is much broader than those of American history, culture, and society, or confined just to this hemisphere, for that matter. U.S. history is a branch of the larger tree of indigenous histories, not the other way around. It's a covetous, invasive branch that thinks it's the tree. An indigenous scholar naturally designates indigenous peoples, nations, and territories as the primary field of study. Yet sooner or later, unless one commits to a narrow field of study and thus narrow indigenous nationalism, an indigenous scholar is obligated to interpret histories, cultures, and societies beyond what is categorically defined as just indigenous to their own field of reference, territory, or region, or worse still, limited by the colonial state definitions of indigeneity that are confined by imperial borders and U.S. racial taxonomies that do not resonate elsewhere in the world. This latter aspect is an internalized U.S. exceptionalism and the acceptance of a colonial and racial definitions externally imposed onto us our people and territory. And while the field of settler colonial studies advanced by the late Australian scholar Patrick Wolfe allows for the comparative histories of settler states, missing from the framework of the elimination of the native, which is his phrase, is the emancipation of the native by the native herself. While it is easy for settlers to imagine and live in a society premised on Indigenous genocide and land theft, it is harder, if not impossible, for settler society to imagine a world that is not. Likewise, without internally derived theories and conspiracies of freedom my ancestors cultivated, imagined, and dreamt into existence, I would not be standing in front of you today. This substance of Indigenous life, of futurity, so often missing in what our studies of death and destruction are the necessary reminders that life need not always be this way. At least that is what our ancestors imagined. If not now, then someday. That was the threat, not merely biological reproduction, but social reproduction, the reproduction of theory and prophecies of freedom, of decolonization. And whereas colonizing nation states tend to exist in relation to each other, for example, Israeli settler colonialism is only possible because of US settler colonialism, and in many ways, an extension of it, liberation struggles also exist in relation to each other. Anishinaabe theorist Leanne Simpson, who's going to be here, that's amazing, has called these formations constellations of co-resistance. Constellations exist only in the context of relationship, she writes. Otherwise, they are just individual stars. Indigenous nations exist in relation to each other, and so too do liberation movements. For example, a primary constellation of what white people call the Big Dipper, we have various names for it, for the Ocheti Shakoi, represents the unity of our nation. 7 stars signify the Ocheti Shakoi, the nation of the 7 council fires, united by the assemblage of stars within and beyond the constellation itself, which represents the Chinupa or the sacred pipe, signifying the capacity to relate, to make diplomacy with other constellations and stars. And like allied fields of study, such as Black studies and ethnic studies, Indigenous studies emerged from revolutionary movements across what W.E.B. Du Bois defined as the problem of the 20th century, a global color line that separated the lighter nations from the darker nations, the colonizer from the colonized. And while Black studies scholars have pointed out the necessity of interpreting a global Black and African experience, partially as a result of the colonization and the diaspora resulting from the transatlantic slave trade, Indigenous studies in the global North has sometimes ignored its own radical origins, deeply entrenched in global solidarities of the time. Indigenous nationhood, likewise, is often misrepresented or misinterpreted as an exclusive project, the sole aspiration of just Indigenous peoples. This is similar to the way the Indian problem is treated as solely an Indian problem, as if Indians themselves are solely responsible for the theft of their continent and their own genocide. It should be noted that structures of white supremacy and settler colonialism, while they do control the lives of the colonized, are also designed, first and foremost, to control the lives and behaviors of the colonizer. The terms Indigenous peoples derives directly from an anti-imperial tradition and language developed by the United Nations, or at the United Nations by Red Power activists. So over the decades, Indigenous conceptually evolved from populations to peoples. The definitions are many, but they generally describe the colonial condition of statelessness of nations or peoples who existed prior to state formation and who have prior ties to territory and prior forms of political authority and governance that arise from that connection to the land. The term Indigenous peoples is both paradoxically about the lives lived in the negative shadow cast by the colonial state and the affirmation of a prior and ongoing nationhood or people. Yet, unlike other revolutionary actors, such as the working class or the proletariat, which according to some traditions seeks its own annihilation along with the ruling class towards a classless society, Indigenous peoples seek not the annihilation of themselves or their identities to achieve liberation. Maintaining, elaborating, and strengthening indigeneity is the very vehicle through which they wage revolutionary struggle. That is not to say Indigenous peoples are not engaged in a form of class struggle, quite the opposite. Indigenous peoples in this hemisphere represent the oldest and longest form of class struggle since 1492. It is therefore a temporal and spatial struggle of resisting erasure from history and maintaining relations with the land and other human and non-human beings. Indigenousness, as Susan Miller reminds us, is fundamentally a way of relating to the colonizer, which could be flight, fight, refusal, accommodation, or diplomacy, and a way of relating to our co-conspirators, human or otherwise. Some call this act of making relatives, making those seen as different into familiars. That, to my mind, is the most profound aspect of indigeneity. Why let the colonizer interpret our histories to us, and why let them tell us who are our friends and enemies?
Is no restart.
Bernie and Trump, they're all the same, Conspiracy, they're 9/11 truthers and people that criticize U.S. foreign policy, who say there's an agenda. I mean, let me ask you a question. Would you create a State Department and have no agenda? Like, why would you make an institution with no agenda? I mean, people have told me this, you over-exaggerate the agenda. And I think that's interesting because I've been in many institutions. Like, for instance, does your department have an agenda?
You're talking.
Right? It's an agenda.
That's an agenda.
I mean, if we went back and looked at it, you had a department meeting.
We did.
And you said, these are the people we'd like to invite.
Just you.
Exactly. That's an agenda. Somebody made a decision. The decision to bomb in Libya wasn't just some random thing. Obama was asleep at night and the phone rang. Hillary said, Barack, we got to do something. We got to do something. Runs down in his, pajamas into the room and, Hillary, what should we do? Well, Barack, I don't know. Generals, what should we do? I think we should aerial bomb. Never thought about that because we've never done that before. We've never used aerial bombardment. I mean, if there's a pattern, there must be a policy. Otherwise, we're idiots. But if you say that, well, then you're like a 9/11 truth person. So this inflation of conspiracy is extraordinary. Now everybody admits, right? Everybody admits, so does Woolsey. Yes, we overthrew the Iranians. When you go back and read the CIA and White House conversations around Chile, 1973, the overthrowing of Allende, there's some very interesting cables which are directly written by Henry Kissinger. Some of them are conversations with Nixon where they say, we have to overthrow that government, but we cannot show our fingerprints. So at the time, they always deny it. We didn't do it. We have nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with Venezuela. Afterwards, 50, 60 years, yes, we did it. Now, we did it Guatemala, Iran, this, 100 bloody coups. But this one, no, we're not doing it. We have nothing. You're a conspiracy theorist. You're crazy. Somebody stands up at a press conference. Excuse me, Sean Spicer, is the U.S. government? No, you're just crazy. I'm crazy. I didn't go on Dancing with the Stars and shake myself like this, right? But no, you're crazy. We're not doing, now we did do that kind of thing. But now, I mean, you literally have to be addicted to something to keep believing they're telling the truth. And what you're addicted to is implicit faith in the government. Yes, bad administrations in the past, not now. Certainly not. How many times did they try to kill Fidel Castro? And now they brag about it. But no, we're not trying to kill Maduro. No, not really. Maybe. We'll see. Part 1, production of amnesia. Part 2. Now, it's a good idea to read... It's a good idea to read US documents. It's a really good idea. Many of them, thanks to hard-fought court cases and laws, have to be brought into the public domain, including through Freedom of Information Act requests and so on. Now, the very fact that these documents aren't taught, not sure if they're taught here, I hope they are, is a sign that we're not actually training people to see the actual recorded history. I mean, this is in plain sight. So everything in this section, which is called Goals of US Imperialism, nice and provocative, everything here is basically almost entirely from a US government document. The first, I think, elemental concept that motivates America after World War II is the concept of primacy, also known as preponderant power. You are going to see this term, primacy, in almost every document produced by the Defense Intelligence Agency, State Department, White House, that is the President's statement on national security. All these documents have this word primacy. The 1947 State Department Policy Planning Staff document has the most clear definition. What is the goal of American power? Okay, there's a goal. What is the goal? And this is what it says. To seek less than preponderant power would be to opt for defeat. In other words, you're seeking for preponderant power. To seek less than preponderant power would be to opt for defeat. It's a pretty harsh statement. Then the next sentence is the best. Preponderant power must be the object of US policy. Now, I didn't see in this document human rights must be the object, bringing democracy to the world must be the object. I didn't even actually see securing all the oil should be the object. Preponderant power. This is 1947. This phrase gets repeated, by the way, including in Obama's national security statement. He doesn't use the word preponderant power, but he uses the word primacy. So number one category, primacy. Second category, hub and spokes. You see, when you go back and read Eisenhower says at many points, we do not want to appear like the colonialists of old. We don't want to look like the British. We don't want to look like the French. We don't want to look like the Dutch. We want a new way, new apparatus to seek preponderant power. Our apparatus cannot be colonialism. Our apparatus is the hub and spoke system. So the way the architecture works is the United States is seen as the hub, the wheel. And then there are these spokes that manage the tire. Okay? That's where the phrase comes from. It's a tire. And the tire is obviously the dangerous area. And I'm going to come back to that tire in a second. So these spokes are important. I mean, one of the great lessons that the State Department took from World War I and II, which, you should see as one long war. It's actually one world war that started in 1914 and ends in 1945. And this is the war for basically hegemony inside Europe and around the world. These are really world wars. I mean, I lost family members in these wars, although when people think of World War II, they basically only think of Americans. Fight, because that's the way the culture industry, I lost family members in Italy because there were a lot of Indians fighting in colonial regiments. In France, there were lots of people from West Africa fighting in those regiments, but I watched that film, The English Patient, which I actually like Ondaatje's novel a lot. And I like the film, but I thought Ondaatje did something very clever in the book and in the film, which is that the Indian was deaf and dumb. The Indian did not speak in the film. The Indian was silent. I thought that was a very clever statement being made. It was almost a, Steven Spielberg type, let's land at Normandy, the greatest generation. Just take out all the colonial fighters. They're all from Iowa and from right? And they're just transfixed by French culture. But where's the Senegalese soldiers and so on that were fighting alongside? They disappear. So in that brilliant way, the State Department recognized that this long war was a result, in Lenin's terms, of an inter-capitalist conflict, and that this had to be managed. it's very interesting. I mean, the Marshall Plan has to be seen in light of this. The attempt at creating the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which was finally created in 1961, the OECD, which is all these European countries and the United States together in a bloc. Eventually, in 1973, it becomes the G7. You know, a smaller number of them become the G7. These were attempts to essentially manage the contradictions between different nation states, particularly inside Europe. So the European project is launched, but the European project is not launched by Europeans. It's launched by Americans. There's something very interesting that's not part of the Brexit debate. The originators of the European Union idea come out of the Marshall Plan. It's not out of some European fantasy, you know, of like European Voltaire or no, it's actually a very interesting project about managing the contradictions within Europe. So what were the spokes? I mean, now the spokes are easier to identify. Of course, Europe was a spoke. At least some key allies inside Europe, you know, were spokes. Colombia is a spoke. South Korea and Japan are spokes. They always wanted India as a spoke, but they got Pakistan instead. I mean, these are spokes. Rwanda today is a spoke for the United States, at least in a very large section of Southeast Africa. The model was to create very close alliances with one or two countries in a region, dominant countries. Brazil was a spoke in South America. Create very close alliances with one or two countries and run your project through them. In other words, they become, let's use an old colonial word, a comprador for your project. You know, they are the people who in the old port cities would bargain for you against the native. You know, the native would bargain for you. And that's what these spokes became. It's an interesting point I'm going to come back to later, but here the Soviet Union was only, in a sense, the ideological unifier, the ideological cement for the spokes coming into the alliance. You know, and by the way, this was all institutionalized. We've forgotten now about the Southwest Treaty Organization, about the Central Treaty Organization. These were all the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, SEATO, CENTO. These were all US government created treaty organizations which were rooted in the spoke. For instance, Central Treaty Organizations was known as the Tehran Pact, based in Iran before the revolution, of course. Then there was the Manila Pact, Southeast Asian Treaty. These were actually institutionalized. And they had a military project with them as well. In other words, basing privileges and so on. So that in Philippines, you had one of the largest US bases eventually get built. So this hub and spokes thing wasn't just ideological. It was infrastructural. It became first institutionalized in these agreements, and then you moved into bases and trade agreements and so on. They were brought very close to the United States. Well, the Soviet Union, I said, was the glue to bring people. They said, we've got to do this to protect from the Soviet threat. But this was actually an illusion. If you go back and look at the history from 1945 at least till the present, there are, let's say, two phases, as it were, the Cold War and then the War on Terror. And in fact, there's a great continuity between these two. I think it's wrong to see the Cold War as one specific epoch and the War on Terror as another one. There's another way to periodize this period, but I don't think it's the Cold War. Because the real problem during the Cold War, and I wrote about this in the Poorer Nations, is not the Soviet Union. It's decolonization. Decolonization was the real threat. And when you read these documents from the 50s and 60s, you see how threatened the United States government was by decolonization. This was the primary threat, because these were the countries from which key raw materials were coming out. The ace in the hole here is oil. And some of the best and most explicit documents from the US government is about oil, but it's not only about oil. So I would like to suggest that the primary contradiction from the 1940s right up till now is the question of decolonization.
And especially because we're a smaller nation, like there's just like an avalanche of paperwork, like fucking bureaucracy. And like there's this whole thing in anthropology where people like study bureaucracies, and I think it's really fascinating to think about the bureaucracy of like
The world of paper.
of everyday, but like the bureaucracy of like Indian life.
Yeah,
you know,
that's true.
like it's so. I don't know.
We've become experts in our own oppression, like through paperwork.
Yeah, or you were talking about earlier, like, you know, like there was like one Tippo at Standing Rock who probably has anywhere from like probably up to like 30, 40, 50 different projects that they're having to deal with.
Because Indian land is always under attack.
Yeah. And then there's so many, it's just like I don't know. I hate it. I'm like, just that's why I'm like, I hate all of these like official words because it's so formalized and it's like death by 1,000 cuts. The like bureaucracy that that tribal employees and governments have to deal with for the federal government they don't really, you know, it's like that's winning, right? You're lucky to have that, you know, if you get that. And it's still like so obfuscated. Most people don't understand it, can't read it, don't have the time. And they're just like throwing everything on. And so there's a lot of...
It's like Elizabeth Warren's policy plans. Who has the time to read all that?
Yeah, it's
She must be Indian then, if she's created these complicated...
Oh my god. Yeah.
So like one of the things that people always accuse Native people of, or always have a question about, is Indian casinos. Do they help the Native nations? Do they help the Native Americans? And one thing I always like think about is Vegas. Like, does Vegas help settlers? You know, but also like how unregulated gaming is in a place like Vegas compared to how regulated Indian gaming is and for Native nations. And there's always this weird assumption that, you know, that Native nations, if allowed to, you know, economically develop, that they'll just become these, you know, ugly, exploitative beasts. But nobody cares about the fact that like Vegas has all of these gaudy hotels and completely extracts and requires the exploitation of the entire region and all like native water and land and all the mining that takes place just for this place to exist. And, you know, part of that legacy comes from when the settlers first traveled across the Great Basin. They were like dying. They were like dying of thirst all the time. But if you read their journals, they were like they weren't in a desert like that was uninhabited. They were coming upon constantly indigenous people here and there. And they're all the indigenous people are looking at them like, yo, like, what's wrong with you? Like, why are you so haggard? Like, you know, like, and the reason why is that because the kind of settler mentality is one of exploitation to live on the land, right? And that's what you're saying in all of these sacred sites is that they have to exploit it to appreciate it, which is like, just, you know, it's mind-blowing. And the fact that this land once sustained life, this desert once sustained lots of life, but then now has itself become unsustainable. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the first Nevada state park is the Valley of Fire, which is like right next to our reservation. Literally, like in order to get to the Valley of Fire, you have to drive through our reservation and our like tribal enterprise. And so we get like a lot of tourists. I mean, it's just like we have a small like gas station and kind of convenience store, casino, restaurant. But I think it's really fucked up because we don't have an agreement with the state of Nevada. It's a bit different. So we actually, me and my mom were trying to just go like cruise through there once. And the worker at the gate was like, oh yeah, because I was like, well, we're Paiute, like can't we just go through? He's like, no, well, you know, the nation hasn't built out a contract like we have like for federal parks, right? Like I could go to Zion, show tribal ID and not have to pay, or the Grand Canyon or Bryce Canyon. But for the Valley of Fire, which is literally right next to us, it's a $10 entrance fee. It's our land, and one of their most like famous hikes is like hikes and walks is like Mouse's Tank, who is like a Southern Paiute fugitive who went out and hid in the desert and used his knowledge of the desert because he was falsely accused criminal. And yeah, that, I mean, it's our land.
Tell that story.
Of a mouse.
Yeah.
So he was accused of murder, and he ended up becoming a fugitive because the cops were after him. And
When was this?
This was in the 1860s, and he went out on the land in the Valley of Fire, and so it's called, the walk now is called Mouse's Tank because he evaded capture, and so he was a famous fugitive. And part of the reason why he was able to evade capture is because he knew the desert and he knew where water would pool. So Mouse's Tank refers to these spaces where rainwater or natural water would collect, and that's how he managed to live and out on the land and escape capture. And so, yeah, it's really messed up because Valley of Fire. So this is, I have this thing where I rant about Lana Del Rey, and I call her career like a perfect case study of whiteness, because she actually filmed a music video out there in 2012 called Ride, where it's like her and her like old like grizzled daddy, motorcycle daddy, you know, like driving out on a motorcycle, and like she's like wearing like a Budweiser shirt and like waving an American flag. Then she also like puts on a big headdress and like is waving a gun around in front of a fire, and shooting off fireworks. And I'm like, yeah, you bought those fireworks from us.
We sold her the fireworks.
We sold her the fireworks. Some people met her. My aunt met her when she was filming out there, but we didn't know like what she was doing. And then I saw the video and I was like, what the f-?
So this is before Johnny Depp and Dior Sauvage.
Yeah. And I mean, plus like those things, they get filmed out and shot out. Like, so Valley of Fire is like infamous for, it's really popular for movie shoots and film shoots. And the last time I was out there was a naked pregnant white woman with the headdress. Like I was cruising because it's stunning. So like people get married out there, and there's fashion shoots, and it's beautiful red rock lands. And there was this like naked pregnant white lady with the headdress on doing like a photo shoot with, you know, she had like the big like lighting gear and everything, and I was just like I rolled down my window and I was like, what's wrong with you? Like, what are you doing? Yeah, so there's a lot of nonsense that goes on.
The secret world of Paiutes.
Like, we didn't even wear headdresses.
So the first time I ever went to Los Alamos National Labs, I actually cried because that's where the nuclear bomb was created, and it was created on sacred Pueblo land.
Yeah.
And it just made like the whole place is just evil. Like it has this sense of evilness. And the only time I've ever felt that is when I was in Palestine. Like the levels of security and just the ethic and the feeling of the place. It just felt like it was gross. The whole project was disgusting.
Yeah.
Most people don't know that your land is the most nuclear bombed land in the world.
Yeah.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. One American town looks like any other when you see it from an airplane window. Trees line the quiet residential streets, and there's usually a highway running through to an industrial area where many town people work. But in every town, you'll find houses like this, run down, neglected. Trash and litter disfigure the house and yard. An eyesore, yes, and as you'll see, much more. A house that's neglected is the house that may be doomed in the atomic age. What would happen to such a town if it were on the outer fringe of an attack directed at a nearby city? We can answer that question, in part at least, even though it hasn't happened yet. A series of civil defense tests were made to discover the effects of atomic heat on American homes. I am going to show you how protective measures can help guard your home against the heat effects of an atomic explosion. This is the Nevada Proving Ground, where tests were made on miniature houses in various stages of upkeep, inside and out. These tests were also made on common fire hazards like dead grass, old leaves, discarded newspapers, and fence structures. Here are 5 fences placed far enough from the explosion that they could survive the blast. The fences in the middle are built of decayed wood. Dry grass and litter simulate conditions you've seen in too many alleys and backyards in slum areas. The trash, litter...
Yeah, so the Nevada test site was created in 1950, and like the nuclear complex was, you know, so they're mining uranium from Navajo lands nearby in Arizona. They're doing the lab work at Los Alamos, did some initial testing, but they're like, oh, we need like a large empty laboratory space, and for them that was Nevada. And so they're like, yeah, there's nothing here. Fuck this. Fuck
just
these,
a desert.
Fuck these Paiute and Shoshone people. There's not a lot of them. They just wander around. And so that's how they created the Nevada test site. And they did above ground atomic testing. There's like really phenomenal, actually here at UNLV, they have like a really phenomenal Nevada test site oral history project. And also just some of the photographs are really stunning. Like you could feel it in Vegas and see it in Vegas. So you have like these like fantastic photos. I mean, if I say fantastic, it's like deeply horrifying photos of people like it's like as if it was a football game, sitting on like stadium seating, like watching it. You had like Miss Atomic, you know, you have like Vegas pinup showgirls with like the atomic plume, like as a headdress, like a Vegas showgirl headdress. So yeah, it's like a really fascinating.
Celebrating the bombing of Paiute land.
Yeah, and so there's the Atomic Museum here, and then they also have one in Albuquerque. And so they have a lot of this kind of imagery, fantastic imagery of like, you know, America and the Cold War. And it was really captivating. But the not as much discussed part of that is its effect on Paiute and Shoshone peoples. And yeah, so it's the most bombed place globally. Like the US, I think it's like 1,032 nuclear tests were conducted by the US up until like they stopped atomic testing, I think in 92.
At the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union as we know it.
Yeah, and so only a small number of the atomic tests were above ground, because then they started realizing the effects of nuclear fallout slowly as horrific things were happening to people and animals, very violent deaths. But they continued the atomic testing underground. And so of those 1,000, I think 100 and something were above ground, and then the rest were underground nuclear testing, as if that is also terrifying. Yeah. Well, terrifying violence.
It's also just like the assumption that life just lives above ground as well, and that there's only value only happens on the surface, and the under what happens like sub terra nullius, so to speak. Anything that happens below the ground, like the extraction, doesn't really matter and it doesn't really count.
Yeah, and I mean that goes to also the linking of like Yucca Mountain. Right, which would also be like the storage of the nation's nuclear waste, which would be underground in a mountain, in Yucca Mountain.
A sacred site.
Yes.
Yeah, and so there's like these new, like the HBO the HBO series called Chernobyl.
Yeah.
Came out.
Oh my God, Jared Harris is so great. Sorry, I really love Jared Harris. It's great.
But there's a lot of there's the nightmare of the nuclear industry is on full display there, but it's actually like, oh, that happened in the Ukraine and Soviet Russia, and this is like not something that the United States has ever dealt with, and most Native people live within the full cycle of the nuclear industry, whether it's mined on their land, whether it's produced on their land, whether it's tested on their land, whether it's dumped on their land. Yeah,
so I think most people would think of like Bikini Atoll, the kind of iconic atomic plume. Nevada, maybe a bit. Chernobyl and Fukushima are 311. And I think the thing about like Fukushima or Chernobyl is it's much more of like the event crisis, much more so than like the industry and duration of that U.S. militarism and like nuclear power, which is all in the Southwest. So Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico. People aren't. So there's something about the eventful. I guess Fukushima is the most recent kind of disaster. I guess that's what I'm trying to think about, the like event disaster, right, instead of the like kind of longue durée of like the nuclear industry and extraction of uranium mining, and then also the long time scale of like the nuclear signature itself, nuclear half-lives, which go up to like 1 million years. And so I think there's a lot of weird, like the temporality of the nuclear industry that people don't really think as much about, or it's like a question of what becomes visible, like whether it's even the Downwinders Act is set to close this year, and that was like I think New Mexico legislatures which are trying to push forward, and so and to extend that period. So the Downwinders offers recompensation to a certain set of categories of people who've been injured by atomic testing, and for the most part so a lot of it's like nearby downwind communities. So the famous test case here is actually in St. George, Utah, which is a predominantly white Mormon community. So it's like who qualifies under the category of downwinder. A lot of those are majority white people, or if they're Native, it's a predominant focus on uranium miners and workers, because it's like, how do you prove the injury? What counts as an injury? How are you going to prove it? Because they have very strict parameters. And then they also, like, you were only able to make a claim on that until 2019. And you think about, the various forms of cancers and the multi-generational violence that occurs in the passing down. It's just such a weird, like the time frames are totally like incongruent, like, and so that's why they're trying to make a case for extending that. But so even though my community is like right, I think we're the nearest like reservation to the Nevada test site, there's been no one who's filed and gotten any sort of downwinder money, even though then it's been newly advertised. You'll see if you watch local Vegas TV, like we watch Jeopardy every night, you'll see like commercials where it's like, oh, were you a worker at the Nevada test site, like call this number and you could qualify for like in-home care if you've gotten like these certain numbers of cancers or whatever. Or now you'll see ads for it in like the local paper. But again, it's geared mostly towards like the blue collar workers, white people.
So like on one hand, settler colonialism is going to be around for 1 million years just in the afterlives of the nuclear industry, which is horrific. On the other hand, the collateral damage isn't even quantifiable because Indigenous peoples fall outside of who counts as a victim.
Can you introduce yourself?
My name is Kathleen Smith. I'm the KBIC Natural Resources Department. I'm the habitat specialist.
Oh, okay. So the KBIC is a Quinoa. I'm saying it wrong.
Kuna Bay
Indian community.
Yes.
And so today we're doing the rice harvest, and I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about. I'm going to say it wrong again. This is me being a Lakota guy here in this camp, but Manoonim. And one of the things I'm really interested in talking to folks about is that this is Lake Superior. It's like the lake of the planet, and just like how climate change has affected rice harvests and what you all are doing to do restoration work here.
Oh, yes. With the restoration work that we're doing here, climate change is definitely here. Not only with that, but with our own environment. You know, with Gitchumgumi, Lake Superior, you know, with Mother Nature, you never know what's coming that year. But with our efforts here, we noticed that this year the water level is higher.
Yeah.
Much higher, you know. So we're actually losing that habitat also, not only within Gitchumgumi, you know, and the inland areas there, but also with our inland lakes. I noticed that the water level is much higher. But then also with our restoration project that we had within our camp, since we don't have harvestable lakes right now, we are trying in our effort to restore it here. You know, like with our teachings, they say if we don't take care of that Manoonim, you know, our resources, sometimes it will go away. Well, guess what? It had happened here. Yeah. We have, you know, certain stocks that do grow. But
and what contributed to the decline of the rice?
It's just the high water levels, and then we're losing that muck that it needs to grow. It can grow within 3 inches of muck to up to a foot of muck.
But also is like extractive industries too, like copper mining.
Copper mining with that legacy mining. There's one area that we have at our Sandpoint Restoration area. We have Mass Mill, which transported their ore over to, it was called Mass Mill, where they processed it. It was about 4 miles up, you know, where we actually have stamp sands that infiltrated into the one restoration site that we do have at our Sandpoint Restoration. So what we've been doing is we've been trying to restore this area, but within time that stamp sand had washed down from that processing area 4 miles down the lakeshore. Wow. And it actually came into an area to where, you know, with the sands, with the change of time, that it actually changed the bottom. We are losing our muck, you know. So with Gitchumgumi and her waves and Mother Nature through time, we lost that wild rice bed that's in there. The last time that our tribe had harvested that area was in 1992.
Wow. And so is it a permanent loss, or is it like, how do you restore once that muck is gone? Is it fixable?
It can be. I believe if we get enough muck to come back, but we're also looking at carp too, which is an invasive species, might contribute to, you know, stirring up that bottom, you know, changing that. As soon as the rice comes up, it could be, you know, deterring it from growing. But there is an area where it still kind of grows, but then we also have ducks that come in, you know, to feed off of that. But with legacy mining, you know, it's very integral to figure out a solution to that problem.
And so they took the copper and then left these communities with the cleanup. Like I mean, no pun intended, but it's the legacy of legacy mining that it's a forever thing. And you're calling the name of this lake Gitchumgumi, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, I said it right. I got one thing right today. Gitchumgumi, and I heard you refer to it with a female pronoun. And one thing that I noticed just being in camp here is that there are a lot of women caretakers, Indigenous caretakers of the rice. And what's that relationship? Because I know you do a water walk.
Oh, yes. As a Anishinaabe Kwe, what our role is to take care of that maybe, you know, that precious life that we have, the Manas and wind, you know. Without water, we would not have life as we know it. And what a lot of people need to realize as Kwe, we take care of her because we are the carriers of life, the carriers of that water. So when we are first put down and lowered onto this earth, we must carry that life within us. And that's where, as babies, within the womb, we have that water. So that connects us to Mother Earth in that way. So there's a reason why we wear skirts, because that connects us to our mother, the key, the earth. So what our role as Anishinaabe Kwe is we have become protectors of that water, that ever gift of given life. And what humans need to realize is that it's all connected. Without water, we would not have life as we know it. We would not have the plant relatives. We would not have the four-leggeds. We would not have Manoonim as we know it, because it's connected to the water. Without that, we would not have food, where we take the energy of that food, that spirit, that Manu get the gone. That's our spirit garden as we know it. Within these lakes here, we also did a restoration project back here in Plumbago Lake. You can actually see the standing rice back there. That's 2 years of restoration. What gift is that, to have that life, that food? With our migration story, we had to go where the food grows on the water. Not a lot of people know that journey took 500 years. So as Anishinaabe, we go as far as to almost to your territory.
Yeah. Well, into our territory.
We pushed you guys back, really.
Yeah. Thanks for taking care of it for us.
So that's why you're here today, to make that connection, to make that connection with Manoonim. Not only is it a gift to us, but it's a gift for everyone that's here. As you see within our own community, there's a lot of like-minded people.
Yeah.
A lot of people that no matter what path that they're on, they could be Christians, there's Jewish people here, Azteca people here. There's a good gift of people with knowledge too that they also bring to us, that help with our restoration effort. Yesterday they were able to put their hand on that life-given seed, from Manoonim. The lakes were a little bit high. But guess what? When we came around that bend, when we went to the Net River outlet, oh my gosh, the rice was just there. And what gift is that? The ceremonies have to be brought back to pray for that water. But we got to pray and be careful what we ask for. We might get too much, which we have. So that goes back to be careful what you ask for also. But we have a great community here with our Manoonim camp, I've been doing this for 4 years now, so it's been here before my time, like Val had said, about 11 years. And with the wonderful teachers that we have, we must make these connections, from the mining. Who's going to be responsible for that waste that comes, that byproduct? As our tribe, we have done much work to be able to restore that area where the stamp sands were. We actually put a 10-inch cap there, and we did a plant restoration process since 2011. Val has been a big part of that. She may not be Anishinaabe, but she is people of the heart.
Right.
Of the heart. That's what it's gathered.
That's what Courtney was saying. She was saying, it's people who are of the same heart. Right. And that's a really interesting way of putting it.
Right.
Does it come from Anishinaabe, teachings?
Yes, it is. The day we win.
The day we win.
People of the heart.
Ah, okay.
So that's what I speak about quite a bit, within our teachings. Eddie Benton, who is our Grand Chief of the Three Fires Lodge, he talks about how our teachings are for everybody, for all walks of life, because people are going to come seeking this information, the eighth fire. As my uncle Donnie says, we're in the kindling phase right now.
So what's the eighth fire?
The eighth fire is a prophecy where everyone's going to be looking upon the indigenous people, for these teachings. We're all going to come together, and become one. And this is what this camp is all about. It's not only for Anishinaabe, but for people from all walks of life, because in the state of Michigan, anybody can harvest rice. So what way is to bring that education? There's no regulations in the state of Michigan right now, but to help educate people from all walks of life. So that's why we have people from Ohio come here.
Yeah.
There's one gal that was doing a chapter about Manoonim, and her book is going to be Endangered Foods. So that brings it back to that restoration process, with climate change. It is here. It is here, because it affects our lakes. It affects our waters, the temperatures. It affects, everything because it's all connected.
I think most people are familiar with Flint, Michigan. And when we said, water is life at Standing Rock or Miniwi Choni, it included, where people get their drinking water, and that this is the struggle of our generation. But what's fascinating about even the way that people think about Flint, Michigan is that they forget that this is also one of the largest freshwater supplies on the planet. And here it is being these just everyday people can't even access clean drinking water. And so I think being out here, it grounds it in the context of the long history of this land, that it has been a struggle for water.
Oh, yes. It's been a big struggle. And the thing is, with our ancestors, it never needed to be that struggle. But nowadays with, the big companies, we need electricity. We need that oil, so it goes back to that education of the public, because we must all stand together and do our part. I was on a board for up there at Michigan Tech on their World Water Day, and I spoke on that panel. And I was like, what am I doing here? I'm not going to be, the academic portion that they seek, but I was able to ask them, what are you going to do? What part are you going to do? Now's the time to do it, to do your part. So we must always start, from our own use of water, that whole respect, because guess what? The youth are watching us. Those are our future leaders. And I really believe that, the education to the youth must get out there to help us protect the water in such a way, because they are our future leaders. They're the ones that are going to see this. They say that over 43% of our water is poisoned.
Wow. 43% of our clean drinking water, you mean? Or the fresh water, I mean?
Yes.
Yeah, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Who are these people? I think there's this tendency in the English-speaking world, especially in the global north, to really kind of have a naive view. People think that just because people are protesting in the street, that somehow these are forces of good or they're opposing tyranny. And it's a very simplistic kind of narrative that's being portrayed. And I remember reading on social media, people were reposting this BBC headline of the police forces joined the protesters in Bolivia, and as if that was some kind of a great achievement. And it's if you look at the United States, when the Proud Boys are rolling through Portland, they're joined by the cops. This isn't, there's an alignment with these particular kind of right-wing forces and the most kind of dangerous elements, right-wing elements of the state. And so who are these people, and what is their backstory in this particular coup in fomenting it?
Well, to understand the opposition forces and the composition of the police and things like that, it's important to also understand who Evo Morales is, because it's not stressed enough that this is a guy who comes not only from an indigenous community, but he comes from the social movements. Evo Morales was a very poor farmer who was a coca farmer, and he was a part of a social movement that was called Movimiento al Socialismo, the movement towards socialism. And then they coalesced into a party largely led by the indigenous communities and their local activists. And he's, of course, the first indigenous leader in the entire history of Bolivia. This is a country that has a history of European colonial domination. And he comes in 2006 and was democratically elected and ushers in this new era where he says, not only are we going to fight for socialism, we're going to fight for sovereignty and equality. And we're going to recognize these indigenous communities who have been not only oppressed, but also intentionally erased from the political architecture of our country for its entire modern history during Spanish colonialism and after Spanish colonialism. And the right-wing opposition, understandably, considering who Evo Morales is, they're the opposite. They are the oligarchs, the descendants of European colonialists. It echoes so many other leaders in the region, but including Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. But one of the key differences is that Hugo Chavez came out of the military. Hugo Chavez always stressed in his speeches, he famously said, I am part indigenous, I am part African, and he stressed and brought in and emphasized indigenous and Afro-descendant communities into the Venezuelan left in a way where traditionally it had been dominated by more, elite educated sectors. And Evo was doing something very similar in his own historical and political context. But the difference, and I think this ultimately is one of the reasons that he didn't have as much state control as Chavez did, is that Chavez was a very popular military leader who had the military on his side. And then throughout the process of the Bolivarian Revolution, he created a new police force, an explicitly revolutionary police force, disbanding the old police, which were the kind of colonial era police. And actually, if you go to Venezuela today, I spent 5 months there this year. I just got back about a month ago. And if you look at the police in Venezuela, they are largely women, and they're largely dark skinned. They're indigenous or partially indigenous or black Venezuelans. And they have a very different function in society because they're not the police as they were before Hugo Chavez came in. And the thing with Evo is that Evo came from the social movements and his base was always at the grassroots. So the institutional power of these forces that have a history of links to colonial domination and being tools of colonial oppression, like the police and the military in Bolivia, he never was really able to control. And, there was always this on and off alliance, and ultimately it was the military, of course, that called for him to step down in this coup. And who are the forces politically behind the coup? Of course, they are the landowners. They are the people from the families who controlled the gas reserves and the lithium reserves that were nationalized by Evo Morales. Because, what's incredible is this idea that Bolivia is a poor country, or any of these other countries throughout Latin America or the global south are poor countries. No, actually, of course, they're very rich countries, not only rich in their history, in their culture and resistance, but also rich in their natural resources. And Bolivia actually, this is kind of a stupid Orientalist name anyway, but it's been referred to as the Saudi Arabia of lithium because Bolivia, well, it's just a stupid name, but but it has 50 to 70% of the world's known lithium reserves. And lithium is very much needed for electronics and for batteries, rechargeable batteries in our phones, our computers, and cars. And Bolivia, Evo Morales recognized that and wanted to use the wealth, not only of the gas reserves, which he nationalized, but also the lithium reserves to benefit the population and to use those resources to fund social programs, to help indigenous communities and work with them to help develop their communities, and also, help build schools and create a universal healthcare system, which he did, which was praised by the United Nations. And his idea, like Chavez with the oil reserves in Venezuela, was to use those natural resources to benefit the whole population and not this small elite of European descendant rich people. And he nationalized, he did what he said he would do. He nationalized those natural resources, and most of the opposition, as you can imagine, are led by these oligarch families that had traditionally controlled those natural resources and have been trying to reestablish control over the political system ever since he came into power 13 years ago.
Yeah, this is like really fascinating because it gets right to the heart of, what my friend Andrew Curley has, correctly called green imperialism, meaning that like there's kind of this, and even Evo Morales has called it a colonial environmentalism. This idea that a place like Bolivia, should function only as a resource colony, right? And if it develops its own natural resources, especially like something like lithium, which is, which will be used if, this kind of current Green New Deal in the United States has anything to say about it, will be used in these, this post-carbon future where Americans will be driving around in their big SUVs with lithium batteries that are mined from places like the Andean mountains, and not just in Bolivia but in other places like Peru. And this is the utter contradiction, the failure in my opinion of the left in the United States and Canada particularly to understand, to fully grasp like what is going on. They would rather have Bolivian children go without schools, go without hospitals, go without basic infrastructure, just so that they could have the kind of moral authority to say this place is pure, while never recognizing the fact that the United States and Canada and first world countries are over consuming, and they're producing 40% of the world's trash, right? So like the United States is 5% of the world's population. It's producing 40% of the world's trash, and they're often dumping it in third world countries and places in the global south. And in this particular context, one of the ways in which this coup, as Sina, he's on the line, as Sina has called it, this gringo fever has been ramped up, is to accuse Evo Morales of being against the environment and being a false kind of prophet of Pachamama, of indigenous people and their defense of the land, while not even taking into consideration that he's a coca grower, right? And that was at one point in time one of the main exports of Bolivia was coca, but because of the U.S. so-called drug war, they've strangled that economy and have prevented them from developing that economy. And if you look at a lot of the graffiti by the opposition and by the right wing and the slogans against Evo Morales, they call him the narco dictator because he's associated with that coca plant. And so it's just really fascinating that this whole thing, and I don't know if you have anything else to say about that, because I think in the US there's this idea that if we change domestic policy, somehow we're going to just be better consumers and better stewards of the environment, while completely ignoring this imperial reality.
The British people, I say the British working class in particular, were very, very strong in the reasons for supporting Brexit. It was about democracy, sovereignty, and the Labour Party really tried to avoid those type of questions during the election, sticking to more of the question of the health services and education. But to a degree, they reduced the human experience, the human condition, to a very one-dimensional approach. And that there's a lot of people are interested in many, many different things. Many different things move and shape on how they understand the world. And that is what they failed to, the British Labour Party failed to take on board that. And that question of how people realised that to have nationalised railways, to have public control of water, to have to defend that public health system required political and economic sovereignty, and that cannot be secured within the European Union. So the people were much more advanced in their thinking and understanding, and much more tactical in their voting than they have been for many, many decades, for many generations. So it's difficult to see where the Labour Party can move forward from here, unless it once again reconnects with the working class in Britain itself. And during the course of the for the last couple of years, the charge of anti-Semitism has been a major factor in the political discussion and debate. This was more an attempt to discredit Jeremy Corbyn and the left. It plays two roles. It played a role of politically undermining him as a political leader within the Labour movement within Britain. Secondly, it was about reinforcing the strategic importance of Israel as a political and military ally of imperialism in the Middle East, both for British and European imperialism and for the United States. So anti-Semitism is now, or the charge of anti-Semitism has now become a weapon against anyone who stands up for the rights of the Palestinian people, who take to a degree an anti-imperialist position in regards to issues in the Middle East. So anti-Semitism, that is now going to be used against Bernie Sanders and others, candidates in the United States, is a weapon to attack anti-imperialist views of the world, to attack the left, to attack those who believe that what is happening to the Palestinians is absolutely wrong, and that the Palestinians are entitled to a homeland, entitled to their freedom, entitled to justice. So this is an ideological weapon, and they brand everyone as being anti-Semitic. They have muddied and confused people as the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Zionism is a political project to establish a state of Israel in lands and occupied lands which were the Palestinian lands, the Palestinian nation. And the Zionists argued the case that the state of Israel, the land what they have now called Israel, was an empty land. There was no one there. It is very much on the similar vein as the settler colonialists of North America, who saw that the North America was an empty land. There was no one there. So, in other words, that the nations of North America who predated the European invasion did not exist, or were not worthy of considering to be nations, to be peoples, but these were just inferior, so slightly above a horse or a beef, a cattle. So the same settler colonialist mentality pervades within the Zionist settlers of Israel, current Israel. So these are all very difficult questions. It's important that people separate the difference between anti-Semitism. We have to remember that all the peoples of the Middle East are Semitic peoples. Palestinians, Syrians, Jordans, they're all of the same Semitic race of people. They all come from the historical same roots. The difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and the importance to maintaining and building the boycott of Israel, the economic and cultural boycott of Israel. It is the main weapon of solidarity with the oppressed Palestinians at this time. So it's crucially important. It is also a crucially important question for the whole question of peace in the Middle East. The defeat of Israel will be a major victory for the peace forces across the Middle East.
In the late 60s, probably most people who lived in the United States at that time thought that all Native people in the Northeast had been killed off. And in fact, that was even taught in school many times. And in fact, we know people who are who are in their 80s who said they were taught that in school here in Massachusetts, that everybody had died off. So there was a real struggle to gain acknowledgement. None of the tribes at the time here in Massachusetts, for instance, had federal recognition or anything like that. So there were a lot of struggles going on. One of the big ones was to get a Boston Indian Center. And in fact, this year is now the 50th anniversary of the Boston Indian Center, which is now called the North American Indian Center of Boston. And there were struggles pretty much on the streets in Boston to try to get that center open. So there were things going on all over the place. So against that backdrop came 1970, which was the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrim landing. And I'm going to let Kisha talk about this more because her grandfather was very deeply involved.
So the town of Plymouth decided to celebrate the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrim's Landing because Thanksgiving is kind of what Plymouth is known for, and they really, really like it. And so they realized they needed Native American representation, and so they asked my grandfather, Wamsuta Frank James, who was a Wampanoag leader, if he would give a speech at the banquet for the 350th celebration. And he said yes. And he went and he wrote a speech, and he had to submit a copy of that speech in advance. And of course, the speech wasn't what they wanted, because the speech talked about the real history of Thanksgiving and the genocide that happened during Thanksgiving. And so the town of Plymouth told him, no, you have to go back. You have to rewrite the speech. And he decided that he didn't want his speech to be repressed. And so that's where National Day of Mourning came from. So he and United American Indians of New England gathered, and he gave his speech, and that's sort of where National Day of Mourning came from.
And as well, people came in actually from other places in the country. Word got out about what was going to be happening down in Plymouth at Plymouth Rock. And people came in from many parts of the country to join in. And there was leadership there from a National American Indian movement. I do want to say that I'm seeing in books now and online at websites that are supposed to be historically accurate that it was American Indian movement who organized National Day of Mourning, and that's not actually true. It was regional people who did that, and the reason that I point that out is not because I'm being anti-AIM in any way. I think the real issue is if people are saying that it was AIM who did everything that day, that really takes away the agency and sovereignty of the Indigenous people from right here in the area, whether they're tribal people who are from this immediate region or all of the urban people and others who would come in from other places. This was really organized here in the area first.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because I think it kind of go alongs with the erasure narrative that's so prevalent in New England, and especially a place like Massachusetts. And when I think of Massachusetts, the only successful protest that Pilgrims ever had there was when they dressed up like Indians, right?
That's right. That was the Puritans,
yes,
and their descendants in Boston. That's right.
But it also just there's an excellent book written by Jeannie O'Brien where she talks about this very kind of prolific sentiment amongst New England places, and especially like the public history and the public memory of what she calls firsting and lasting. The first colonist, the last Indian. And when I was there, I lived in Boston for a year, and I couldn't, even when I describe this to people would just like look at me like I'm crazy. But I was like, Boston was the most racist city I've ever lived in. And I'm from South Dakota, right? and people get shocked by that. And the other thing that was really, we Melanie and I attended a National Day of Mourning back in 2017, I believe it was. And right. The one thing that was really eerie about it is that I realized at that moment when we were driving to Plymouth that all the horror movies that we grew up with were all filmed in New England. And so there's this kind of like underlying like horror, fantasy of the kind of Pilgrim mythology that the New World is especially horrific. And I think the area of this, where this is held, plays, an important place in, or holds an important place in kind of the American imaginary and how people in the U.S. think of this kind of Pilgrim mythology. And can you talk about the quote unquote first Thanksgiving and the reason why you hold the National Day of Mourning on that specific day?
Sure. I do want to mention that book that you spoke about, Firsting and Lasting, is excellent. And I use it as a resource a lot. One of the things that we've been working on for the last several years here is to go from city to city and town to town, trying to get them to abolish Columbus Day and celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day instead. And when we get into these towns that invariably have a town history and even town signs that say what year they were settled or established, as though that was the beginning of time, we constantly are dealing with people who are shocked that they're on Indigenous land, who think that we're all extinct, and who are in deep denial about the Indigenous past before the settlers got here. And so it's something that we're dealing with here all the time, is that erasure. And it has a big impact on the work that we're able to do publicly here, because a lot of times we're going out and just trying to make it clear to settlers that we are still here. And not only that, but we obviously have a lot of things to say and to talk about. And overcoming that colonial erasure is really has been a big lift for many years here. I'm going to have Kisha talk, though, about the National Day of Mourning and the first year and stuff.
I think the question was about
Thanksgiving.
The Thanksgiving myth, and the Thanksgiving myth, as I know it, as it has been explained to me in school multiple times, is that the Pilgrims came over from somewhere in Europe because they needed religious freedom, and they got to America, and they were starving, and the Wampanoag tribe and the local Indians fed them and helped them get through the first winter. And so to celebrate that, the Indians and the Pilgrims sat down to a lovely feast on Thanksgiving with turkey and all sorts of things. And they were best friends. And then the Indians sort of faded into the background. And, America was established.
Right. I just want to read a quote from that suppressed speech of your grandfather, Wamsutta Frank James. He says, "It is with mixed emotion that I stand here to share my thoughts. This is a time of celebration for you, celebrating an anniversary of a beginning for the white man in America, a time of looking back, of reflection. It is with a heavy heart that I look back upon what happened to my people. Even before the Pilgrims landed, it was common practice for explorers to capture Indians, take them to Europe, and sell them as slaves for 220 shillings apiece. The Pilgrims had hardly explored the shores of Cape Cod for 4 days before they had robbed the graves of my ancestors and stole their corn and beans. Mort's relation described a searching party of 16 men. Mort goes on to say that this party took as much of the Indians' winter provisions as they were able to carry. Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag, knew these facts, yet he and his people welcomed and befriended the settlers of the Plymouth plantation. Perhaps he did this because his tribe had been depleted by an epidemic." And I think this, can you maybe talk about that, that quote unquote first encounter, but also the fact that, the Wampanoag people had already had knowledge of previous Europeans. And it wasn't, in many ways, the Pilgrims were just a new flavor of Europeans arriving to the shore. Can you maybe talk about that first encounter, but also how it was part of this longer history?
So this is kind of a hot topic in my tribe and in Wampanoag, among Wampanoag people in general, because sometimes we do feel a little responsible for keeping the Pilgrims alive. I've seen several articles written by Wampanoag people about sort of grappling with the guilt of the Wampanoag people feeding the Pilgrims. But I also there is some pride as well, because it does show, I think, that the Wampanoag people were better than the Pilgrims, because they knew that they had robbed their ancestors' graves and all this stuff, and yet they were still willing to help them because they didn't want other human beings to freeze. And what they got for that was centuries of oppression. And so I think it just speaks to the difference between the Pilgrims, who probably would have let whoever they encountered starve, versus the values of the Wampanoag.
Well, you mentioned there that there was an epidemic. There were actually multiple epidemics because European explorers kept so-called exploring and landing on the coast, all up through the coast, going up into Canada. And wherever they landed, there would be epidemics. And by the time the Pilgrims arrived, well over half, maybe up to 90% of the population.
Yeah, it's estimated that about 90% of the population in the New England area had already been wiped out. So what the Pilgrims essentially did was wipe out the remaining 10%. So there's also sort of the element of the Wampanoag really didn't have a choice, because they knew what these settlers were capable of, and they knew the diseases that these settlers brought. So it was sort of do this or, get killed one way or get killed the other way.
And I think it's important to talk about the role of slavery that rapidly developed. Samoset, who famously sort of just came out of the forest and welcomed the Pilgrims at Patuxet, which is what Plymouth was called, had actually been kidnapped by one of the earlier ships and taken to England and held there and displayed there and, forced into servitude and that kind of thing. So he actually had a perfect idea of exactly how barbaric the English were, because he had seen it firsthand for a lengthy period of time in England, and certainly knew about the weaponry that the Europeans had as well. So I think those kind of things are important factors. A lot of times people talk about the enslavement of African people, and that is a key thing to talk about, very important. And it's something that's not talked about enough, just as anti-Blackness is not talked about enough within our Indigenous communities, I would add. Having said that, there were Indigenous people enslaved as well, all over the place, and particularly in so-called New England. It was a very standard thing to do. And at the end of what was called King Philip's War in 1676, the combatants and their families were either killed or sold into slavery into the West Indies. That was just a normal, common practice that they had here. Crispus Attucks, who's very well known for taking part in what is referred to as the American Revolution, was in fact Wampanoag and Black, and that's often not acknowledged. So I think it's, what they witnessed from the beginning of the English coming was so many elements of barbarism. I don't know how else to say it, with the way that the English acted toward people and enslaving people and insisting that their own laws and customs be followed. And then if you've watched your entire village die off and see this devastation and people, who don't even have their families left, it must have been like the end of the world, and because it was.
Yeah, and so when people, I think it's very easy to put blame on the Wampanoag and also on Massasoit because they fed the Pilgrims, but also at the same time, I think Massasoit did it because I think he was hoping that it would spare his tribe and spare his people, and it didn't, and that's the real tragedy of it.
Is no restart. So also want to thank you all for allowing me to share the stage with these awesome movement scholars and to be in a space with such rigor and sharp politics. But I think one of the most compelling aspects of this conference is that we're all here together centering anti-imperialism. There's a broad base of people who are impacted in various ways, and together we're asking critical questions and interrogating them. One thing that we have named today and that we need to continue to do is that we need more spaces like this. In 2019, we cannot take for granted what we say when we say anti-imperialist. We cannot take for granted that we all understand our histories of resistance the same way. And we also know that things have changed since 1968. So just like things have changed, so too does our resistance need to change. But before we do that, we have to begin to interrogate and really come together to have a shared understanding of what imperialism is. I won't repeat what my co-panelists have said, but it is important to just emphasize that the world order has changed, alliances have changed, the global political economy has changed, and how have our tactics and strategies changed? What has worked in the past and what hasn't? And in this particular crisis, what is needed? We need more analysis, we need more political education, we need more spaces like this, and we need to come up with some real strategy. If imperialists are building alliances, if they're consolidating power, if they're aligning themselves in ways that continue, that we haven't seen before, but that we need to know that we have to counter them, we need to come up with ways that we too are not siloing our movements, but we're uniting our struggles. What used to be a fight for national liberation has now become a fight for humanitarian relief. What used to be a fight for self-determination has now become a fight for social services. The elites have made it virtually impossible for us to take any real steps to force material alliances with people struggling for self-determination around the world. So the real question is, and there maybe perhaps the answer comes with this question, how can building a real internationalist movement challenge that directly? How are we building alliances that are wider and deeper for all of us to understand ourselves as true internationalists and to understand ourselves as struggling against imperialism? If one of the tasks is to better understand imperialism or the current shapes of it, and another task is to uplift and embody internationalism, the question then for us is, how can we take away from today and for the rest of this weekend what would be possible with a heightened political consciousness? What's possible if we learn from our shared histories and from each other and to begin to actually build this international alliance today? So in order to do that, we have to also figure out how the heck do we fight imperialism? And specifically, how do we fight imperialism in the belly of the beast? And that brings us to a very core question that's already been posed today. Why the hell is there not an active and strong anti-war movement in the United States? If we understand that we need a strong alliance and that things are quite dark because of the way imperialist forces have aligned themselves and the proxies they have built across the world, there is no longer a clear global south and a global north. We are in some ways in a position of weakness. We don't have all the answers, but what we need to do is humble ourselves and learn from existing attempts at socialist projects around the world that are confronting U.S. imperialism head on. We need to show support for those struggles while also making room for differences and making room for questions. We need to look to Venezuela and Cuba's socialist projects as a contribution to anti-imperialism. We need to look to all the struggles that are directly confronting imperialist forces and support them in that struggle. You may not agree with all the policies and practices of these projects or their leaders, but we should all agree that they are targets of the United States and the West because of their potential power for an alternative economy to that of the high capitalism and alternative way of life for a better future for us all. So, if we are against the subordination of peoples of the world to the narrow interests of capitalist elite, if we stand against the exploitation and plunder of all peoples in this environment, if we're firmly grounded in the principles of anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism, then we must resolutely reject any form of warfare on any of our respective homelands. So what are we doing today in the belly of the beast? There are multiple fronts for us to fight. We have to offer our solidarity to struggles around the world and understand that when we do that, we're not just supporting others in these faraway places. We are contributing to our own very local struggles right here. Making sure that we also lift up the struggles for democracy and authoritarianism in the Philippines. Making sure we don't lose sight of the uprisings in Haiti, those who are still paying the price of the coup against Aristide, and for the first successful slave revolt in history. We have to continue to fight Western intervention and corruption for all people trying to live in dignity, and ensuring that even when struggles for self-determination are given no to little attention, that we uplift those struggles, like our brothers and sisters in Kashmir today. In these struggles, we find potential. On a national level, there are many potential shifts. There's new alliances being built. Even if we want to distinguish between what's happening in countries around the world and what's happening at our doorsteps, we can't. It's coming right here to our doorstep. We are now finding each other in locations and fighting together against the root causes of forced migration. The term, the local is global, is no longer just a term. We are feeling it every single day. And that is why we have things like the Squad in Congress. That is why questions around socialism and climate justice are actually wedge issues. That is why the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement against Israel is actually being discussed in Congress in the United States. Locally, people are fighting against ICE. The fight against forced migration, against war and imperialism, that is in fact the fight against ICE. Opposing Trump's wall is opposing border imperialism. We must support all those struggles, including the migrant caravan, because we understand them as inherently internationalist, and creating room for all of us to embed a true anti-war agenda, analysis, commitment, and demand. And now let us look to a real true place of solidarity and potential that's reflected in this space. Let's look to the United States attempts to completely annihilate Indigenous resistance to the colonization of this land, to continue to disappear Indigenous people, to annihilate the Black liberation struggle. They have failed. The United States and the Israeli partnership in global repression and militarization, their attempts to silence, just critiquing repression and militarization, are failing. Standing Rock, one of the largest mobilizations we have seen in this country, addressing capitalism and resource extraction, was an amazing show of solidarity, but a testament that the United States project is failing. It broke down silos. It was articulating a practice of socialism, a practice of indigeneity. It's something that we should continue to learn and continue to build on for our work today. The movement for Black lives, bringing to the forefront Black struggle and Black liberation and Black self-determination in this country. These are sites of hope for today. And Palestine. Palestine has become a wedge issue. Standing Rock has made Indigenous struggle a wedge issue. The movement for Black Lives Matter has also made anti-policing and anti-Black violence a wedge issue. Here there is great potential for all of us in international solidarity between Indigenous, Black, and the Palestinian struggles, and we must forge alliances of resistance. I want to speak for a second about the role of Palestine. It's been discussed a lot today, and I want to bring that as also an area of potential, a potential forged alliance, an actual campaign to chip at U.S. imperialism. As Palestinians, we've always understood our struggle as a radical one about land, resources, self-determination against the forces of colonialism and militarism. Israel is, in fact, a partner to U.S. imperialism. They're one of the smallest nation states, yet receive more military aid than any other country in the world. The second being Egypt, which also borders the other side of Palestine. And demographically, Palestinians are winning. The Zionist attempts, those attempting to create a Jewish state in historic Palestine, a colonial settler state in historic Palestine, were basing the idea that we would be ethnically cleansed by now, and they're losing. The U.S. government's attempt to crush any dissent against Israel is not working, and the potential of us winning this fight is tremendous. Never would I think in my lifetime that we would see Congress talking about BDS or trying to go on an alternative delegation to occupied Palestine. The role Israel plays as an instrument to U.S. imperialism in our region must also be addressed. You can't understand Syria or Yemen. You cannot understand what's happening even in Kashmir or in Iran without paying attention to the role of the settler colony, that being Israel. Israel plays a role in expanding the market for the military. Israel plays a role and as a laboratory for military and surveillance tactics and weaponry used on Palestinians. So by challenging Israel and using boycotting, divesting, and sanctioning Israel, in other words, isolating Israel politically, economically, and socially, we would most definitely create some dent in U.S. imperialism. And if U.S. imperialism pits us against each other, then our job today is to come and forge alliance together. We have to act boldly and be driven by the spirit of solidarity and internationalism that has anchored and propelled our movements for generations. And solidarity is not just about making parallels and comparisons. It's about shared visions, shared political projects, and collective strategies. So what's possible today if we unite across communities to understand the domestic manifestations of fascism, of settler colonialism, of white supremacy, and Zionism as inextricably linked? How do we understand this moment and its vulnerabilities so we can actually build power and shift conditions that are threatening the well-being of all people in the world? Just as the alliances of the elite make possible the suffering of so many, our solidarity make possible a new world and new future for all of us. After all, what unites us and other oppressed people around the world is not the ravages of U.S. imperialism, but rather our ongoing resilience and our shared political commitments, our commitment to dignity and self-determination, a new way forward where all people can have the freedom to move, the freedom to stay, and the freedom to return.
it off at your
Pittsburgh is no
restart.
result. You
It's 800
be
other kind.
only music. Under